Hello and welcome to my Miniature Addiction Club. If you're new here, my name's Lou and today I'm going to be showing you how I made a miniature 12th scale sofa for my room box. But before I get started, I just want to say a huge shout out to my family in Australia who are watching, especially my nephew Owen. It makes me so happy to know that you enjoy watching my videos. Now let's get started. The first thing I did before starting this project was to research the style of sofa I wanted to make. So I pulled up some images on the internet and saved them as a reference. I wanted to make a simple white sofa with a relaxed, comfy feel, but you could use any sort of fabric you like. Next, I cut out all of the pieces for the sofa out of foam board. I also made a template out of graph paper so I could get an idea of the footprint of the finished piece and place that inside my room box. For the base of the sofa, I cut out and glued 4 sheets of 5mm foam board together and trimmed it to measure 14 by 6.5 centimeters. The 2 side pieces measure 6.5 by 5.5 centimeters and are made from 2 layers of foam board. You can buy a 10mm foam board which would cut out a few steps, but I'm using up scraps that I had laying around. The backrest measures 14 by 5.5 centimeters and is also 2 layers thick. Before we start assembling the pieces, I'm just giving them a light sand to even out the edges. You could also fill them with some spackle before sanding if you wanted a super smooth finish. Next, I coated the top of the base in a layer of Aleene's tacky glue. I'm using a scrap of foam board to spread it around. That way I don't have to wash out a paintbrush later on. Then I went ahead and placed it glue side down onto my piece of fabric. I did the same for the side pieces, leaving enough fabric to wrap around them later. Once the base had dried, I coated 2 of the edges in glue and wrapped the fabric over. I left that to dry and did the same to the back piece. Then I applied glue to both of the armrests and folded the fabric over. I left it to dry, then I glued down the excess fabric on the bottom of the base and back pieces. Then I folded over the edges and trimmed away any excess fabric before gluing the fabric in place. Here is the back piece finished, and I followed the same steps on the base section. Then I went back to the side pieces and cut and folded the fabric over the ends, trying to make as neat a fold as I could before gluing it down. Here you can see where I folded the fabric over onto itself to create a neat edge. I prefer this method, but you could also just add glue or fray stopper to the edge of your fabric. I did this to both ends of each armrest and left them to dry. Then I measured and cut this piece from some cardstock, which is about 2 mm smaller on each side than the assembled sofa. I glued it to the fabric just like I did the other piece. Once again, I trimmed the edges and mitered the corners before folding and gluing down the fabric. Now that we have all of our structural pieces, it's time to assemble them. I'm applying tacky glue to the edge of the back piece and gluing it flush to the base section. I left that to dry before going ahead and gluing on both of the armrests. Next, I added a mapped pin in each corner to raise the sofa off of the ground a little. You could add any sort of leg that you want, but I'm covering up the bottom of my sofa with this strip of fabric so you won't actually see them. I took a strip of fabric around 2.5 centimeters wide and folded each edge over by 5 millimeters. I ironed it flat and I hemmed the bottom side with glue and let it dry. Next, I cut a small slit at each corner and folded back a tiny edge of the fabric, gluing it in place. Then I glued the strip of fabric to the sofa so that the bottom sat in line with the feet. I was careful to only glue down the folded edge so that the trim could hang freely. I didn't quite have enough fabric to meet up in the middle, so I'm trimming it so that it just wraps around to the back. Ideally it would go all the way around, but no one is going to see the back, and I'm trying not to be too much of a perfectionist. Then I applied glue to the back section and attached that as well, which will cover up all of the joins and excess fabric, as well as strengthening the finished piece. Here's how it's looking so far. Now we just need to make the squabs and cushions. To make the squabs, I traced my template, which was 5.5 by 6.5 centimeters, and added a seam allowance. I cut 2 pieces for each squab. And then I cut a long thin strip that was big enough to wrap around the rectangle and was about 3 centimeters wide. I hand-stitched the strip along the rectangle I had traced onto my fabric. I folded the strip around the corner and made sure the ends met at the centre back. Then I backstitched the entire piece to reinforce my seams. If you didn't want to sew the squabs, you could wrap them in fabric and glue the folds, but I wanted mine to have a more defined shape. Once that was done, I trimmed off some of the seam allowance to remove any excess bulk. Then I traced onto my fabric the height of the foam for the squab. Then I stitched the other rectangle onto what I had made so far, lining up my ruled pencil lines. Once I had sewn it all together, I trimmed my seam allowance and turned it in the right way. Before I put the foam into the squabs, I decided to remove some of the foam to create a hollow look in the cushion, so it looked like someone had been sitting there. You could skip this step if you wanted to. Then I put the foam into the cover and stitched up the back. I repeated the process for the second squab and glued them to the base of the sofa. To make the cushions for the backrest, I traced out 2 rectangles for each one, measuring 7.5 by 5.5 centimeters. I left a seam allowance just like I did for the squabs. I like to make my seam allowances larger than I need them to be so my fabric doesn't fray while I'm stitching. I sewed each cushion up, leaving a small opening at the bottom. Then I trimmed the seam allowance and mitered the corners. Next, I turned them in the right way, using a chopstick to gently push out the corners. To stuff the cushions, I'm using up scraps of fabric that I trimmed into small pieces. I find this adds a more realistic weight to the cushions rather than using hobby fill, and it is a great way to use up any waste. Then I went ahead and stitched up the openings and glued them to the backrest. And there we have our finished sofa. I hope you enjoyed this easy sofa tutorial. If you did, please don't forget to like and subscribe. I post 2 videos each month and I have a ton of exciting projects I'd love to share with you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.